All right, Sridhar, let's start by introducing our audience to yourself as well as to Elemental Machines.
Okay, sure. So I am Sridhar Iyengar, the founder and CEO of Elemental Machines. And just to give a little background about myself and the company, I think it's best to start off through my own personal career. So I am Elemental is my third startup, and I've been doing startups ever since I finished my studies about 20 years ago. So I'm a undergraduate education was in electrical engineering with a focus on signal processing and mathematical modeling. My master's and PhD was in biochemistry with a focus specifically on biological and chemical sensors. So my entire career has been involved in sensors. My first startup was really a continuation of my PhD work, which was in glucose sensors for people who have diabetes. So that company I started back in 2001. That company is still running independently after 20 years. The company is called Agnimatrix, and it is a company that makes a lot of the blood glucose meters that you see on the market. We actually make the CVS brand of glucose meter, the Target Pharmacy brand, Kroger brand. We also make all of the white labeled glucose meters for Sanofi. Our claim to fame through all of that was we made the world's first medical device to plug into the iPhone, and that was obviously a glucose meter that we launched in 2010, so very early days of digital health, and that's what really caught Sanofi's attention, and that's how that partnership happened. But what really made the company sustainable was everything we did behind closed doors in manufacturing. And the problems that I solved back then were the inspiration for what we're doing today at Elemental Machines. So back then, 15 years ago, we were scaling up production of our glucose sensor, glucose strips, test strips. But those were being made at a contract manufacturing facility out in East Asia. And so the challenge that we had was when a production run was completed, it would be almost a month before we received those samples here in Boston, New England area, to do quality control testing and acceptance testing. So if we saw something in the data today that looked like something wasn't going properly in the factory, that was made a month ago, and we were making anywhere between 1 million to 2 million sensors on a daily basis. So that was a few $1 million at risk. Mm-hmm. And so we had to really understand what was happening in the factory right then and there, and not have to wait a month to get the product and then look at things. And so, bearing in mind, this was 15 years ago. This was pre-Amazon, pre-AWS, pre-cloud, pre-Bluetooth, all of this. So getting data out of the factory was actually very challenging. And so we did that in a very manual method. We talked to our partners. They put, I would say, dumb sensors around the facility. So things like, temperature and humidity had a huge effect on the chemistry of what we were doing. But also things like mechanical counters on machines to know how often they were used. And so all that was typed into Excel, emailed to us, and then over the course of about 18 months, we were able to model production quality and actually predict 2 to 3 months into the future. And that allowed us to reduce our average scrap from 20% down to below 1%. And that was a tremendous amount of savings in terms of yield that gave us the financial ability to actually go and bid aggressively for the store brand white label deals with the CVS and all these sorts of companies. And that was a great learning experience for me, because I realized that the power of data, just looking at the data and being able to model it gave us tremendous value. Mm-hmm. The challenge was 15 years ago, There was no cloud. There was no IoT. There was no Bluetooth. It just really was very, very difficult from an implementation standpoint. But the lesson stuck with me that, wow, if you can basically measure everything, you can do wonderful things that have real business value. So then, in 2011, my business partner and I started our second venture together. It was a wearable tech company called Misfit Wearables, and we were heavily inspired by what we by the digital health area that we were exposed to as soon as we had made our iPhone glucometer. So we wanted to do something in digital health, and back in 2010, really the only way to do that was to not be a medical device, but to be a consumer electronics product, a health and wellness device. So in 2011, we started Misfit, and we made fitness trackers. And we grew that very rapidly, and then we ended up selling that to a watch company called Fossil back in 2015, I believe. Now, what was interesting about Misfit was our fitness trackers were just motion sensors, accelerometers, and we had almost 1 million people using them around the world. And it occurred to me that we had kind of accidentally and inadvertently created a globally distributed sensor network. And I was sitting here going, wow, I can see data from 1 million sensors around the world with less complexity, less effort, less latency, less cost, less maintenance, and less difficulty than trying to get data off of a few dozen sensors, literally in one factory, just 3-4 years earlier. Mm-hmm. And that was really the inspiration for Elemental Machines. So I saw this opportunity where we could really just take 80-90% of what Misfit had built in terms of infrastructure, repurpose it and reskin it, and turn it into enterprise B2B offering, and actually build the products that I wish I could have just bought a few years earlier. So at Agrimatrix, we had to build everything from scratch, and I'm sitting here going, here at Misfit, we have basically 90% of what's needed to create smart factories. And instead of an accelerometer, you can just put whatever sensor you want. And in fact, you can be sensor agnostic. You can just have a digital interface, and everything else, the connectivity, the fleet management, the cloud backups, the cloud visualization, the analytics, everything was already there. And so that was sort of the idea. And as I was thinking about this, we started a process for selling Misfit to Fossil. And so at that point, I decided, I think this idea has some legs. So let's create a new company and let's run with it. And that's how Elemental Machines got started.
And did you were you able to use the technology that you had built for Elemental Machines?
So we decided. So simple answer is no. The reason for that was we didn't want to complicate any of the potential acquisition mechanics with Fossil. We wanted that to be very, very clean and not complicated. And truth be told, it was this is something that we felt we could build from scratch anyway. So.
Okay, all right. So Elemental Machines. Let's talk about which customers did you start working with? Where did you start getting your early traction, and what kind of use cases, and what exactly? How did it play out? Your thesis.
Yeah. So. This is actually a very, very good question because it shows that every startup, when you start out, you don't really know exactly what the product market fit is, and so our journey in the early days kind of shows this. So my original thesis or hypothesis, if you want to call it that, was that we can make it very, very easy for factories to create a smart factory and measure everything, have it go to the cloud, and customers can use that data to do their own modeling, or we can model it for them and improve their production and all of that. And I wanted to start with life sciences, biotech and pharmaceutical companies, and med tech, mainly because that was the world I had come out of, and I had some contacts. I had the proverbial Rolodex. And so I went to people that I knew in the industry, and I said, hey, this is what I'm building. What do you think? And universally, folks said, that's a great idea. Yes, it's needed. Because here's what happens. when somebody invests 10, 20, 30 million into a factory, that factory has to run for 10 to 15 years. But 5 years into it, the people who are running it are not necessarily the ones who designed it. And there's a lot of retrofitting, there's a lot of enhancements you need to do. And so we were going to be that layer to make it very, very easy. But the challenge was, and the feedback we got almost universally was, fantastic idea. However, unless you have ISO 9001 certification, unless you have CFR Part 11 compliance, unless you have this, and this, we can't really use you in production because unless you have all that, it places a huge burden on us to have to validate everything. And so they said, it's just not worth it. Please come back when you have all that certification. And when you're 3 or 4 people working out of as a startup, you're not there yet. But what we also heard from these same people was, why don't you go talk to our colleagues in the R&D departments instead of us here in manufacturing? Because they have many of the same problems that we do, but they have none of the regulatory requirements. So they may be early adopters for you. And we've heard that from multiple folks. So that's what we did. We talked to the R&D folks in the same companies, and they all said, yeah, this is great. Come on in. We'd love to try out what you're doing. And so that's how we got pulled into the lab and R&D side of pharmaceutical and biotech and medtech companies. And that was a real learning. Then that product market fit product was great, but the regulatory part of it we were not
complex.
able to hit. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So explain to me, double click down a little bit on the lab of medtech and tell me how exactly your product plays in that environment.
Yes. So what we've seen in the last, say, 10 years or so, there's been a tremendous acceleration of biotech and life science startups, much more so than the decade prior to that. And one of the specialties or areas of focus is this field called synthetic biology. And with synthetic biology, it's basically what we used to call genetic engineering 20, 30 years ago, but genetic engineering with a whole new set of tools and a whole new set of computational systems that we can bring in AI techniques to find patterns that you couldn't find before. And so what we've seen is in the preclinical research phase, there's a tremendous push and need for data, unlike any time before. And so what that means is the people who used to run the labs, forget the scientists for now. Let's just talk about the people who support the lab operations.
The technicians.
The lab managers, the IT managers, everyone who supports the activity of the scientist, they're facing challenges that they never had to deal with 10 years ago. So as an example, what they're finding is in order for the scientists to actually run good models, they need data from everything. We have customers that say, we need to know not only the data coming off of the machine, but we also need to know things like when was the machine calibrated, because we're seeing differences between machine A and machine B, even though they're supposed to be doing the same thing. We're seeing differences. So when was it calibrated? And also, what's the location? The same machine in room 1 and the same machine in room 2 give different results. Well, it's because they're on different, one is by the window and one is by the air conditioning. And that level of scrutiny wasn't there, 10 years ago, because now what the scientists have and the data scientists, what they're doing is they're cross-correlating and finding, really, really sensitive differences between different types of procedures and protocols. And what they're finding is that there's a lot of unknowns, and the lab managers and the technicians and all these folks are having to collect this information and present it to them in a way that they can do computation on. And so It's very similar to the analogy that I make for my friends who are in the pure software industry is there's an entire field of software called DevOps or developer operations. DevOps is a very hard field. It's hard to find a good DevOps engineer these days. However, you go back 10, 15, 20 years, the people who are doing DevOps now, back then they were called systems administrators or sysadmins. And sysadmins were the folks that you never really saw. They were in a windowless basement, and you only approached them when things went wrong. But with the advent of cloud computing and the advent of a tremendous amount of other third-party tools, the sysadmins had to expand and grow into an entirely new field called developer operations, DevOps. That's what we're seeing in life sciences. The lab managers are having to grow into lab operations managers, LabOps. So lab managers and technicians are becoming LabOps because they're having to deal with things like how do you get this data into the cloud so that the scientists can access them? What about information security? What about encryption? What about interoperability? There's instruments that these people use that are 15, 20 years old that were designed in a time that was pre-internet. So how do you even get data off of these machines? Because even today, in a lot of labs, data is manually written down on paper in physical lab notebooks, and then typed into Excel, then copied into Google Sheets, and then imported into XYZ. So lab operations is going through this transformation where the hunger and need for data is outpacing the technologies that can support that. And that's a huge driver for what we're doing.
And how, architecturally, how is your product deployed in a lab setting? Is it a bunch of sensors that are put on machines? Is it software that is getting installed on machines? What is the deployment architecture?
Yep. So the best way to think about us is we're a hardware-enabled SaaS system. So we pull data off of machines, instruments, and environments, and all that goes to the cloud. And there's really principally two different modes of operation. So one is just straightforward sensors. So the sensors that are relevant to life science work. So temperature, humidity, air pressure, light levels, examples of sensors that we actually pack into our own little box. Our devices are called elements. So element A is ambient, has temperature, light, humidity, and air pressure built into it. We have one called element T for temperature, and that's for extreme temperatures, cryogenics, minus 200 Celsius up to high temperature ovens. And we use those for when the machine or instrument doesn't have any output, and we need to we need to really understand what's happening. So the most common example is controlled environments, so cold storage, refrigerators and freezers. We use an element T. And the thing that I'll highlight is in the last year, because of the pandemic, cold chain and cold storage has come into the media spotlight. So I'm sure you probably come across those news articles maybe 6, 8, 9 months ago that said, a whole bunch of vaccines were lost because the freezer failed. And all of a sudden, my friends who don't really know about this industry kept saying, how can freezers fail? I'm like, well, it happens a lot more than you realize. Nobody writes about it. But now with the pandemic, it's getting media spotlight. So for machines and instruments and environments that don't have built-in sensors, we have our own sensor boxes. The other mode of operation is we do have a analog and digital interface, so we can plug into machines and instruments, pull data from them directly, and shoot it to the cloud. So the whole idea is we have hardware, whether it's independent sensors or just a analog digital interface, we can plug into third-party machines, third-party sensors, and pull everything to the cloud. It's all wireless through Wi-Fi with cellular backup, and goes back to one of our cloud servers.
Very interesting. So, what level of adoption are we talking about in the lab ops, as you called it? How many? What is the pace of adoption in this world that you are working with?
Yeah. So it really depends on the type of company that we're working with. So I had mentioned synthetic biology. Well, the synthetic biology companies out there were very, very early adopters. They were our first adopters, and because of the need for the data. And the reason why I highlight the synthetic biology community is if you look at life science companies in general, biotech and pharma and all that, I have a thesis, and at some point I'm sure I'll write a blog post about this, but I'll give you a quick preview about my opinion here. I have a thesis that the more traditional biotech and pharma companies were really founded and led by traditional scientists, biochemists, chemists, so on and so forth. And the way research was done was very cause and effect. You had a hypothesis, you do a bunch of experiments, you get data, you understand what happened before you take the next value-added step. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. That's how I was trained. However, if you look at the new generation of startups, especially in the synthetic biology space, many of them are founded and run by not necessarily classically trained scientists, but by computer scientists or engineers or data scientists. And the way that these folks approach the same problems can be quite different. And it's very much more of a correlation-based approach. And I say that because you don't necessarily need to understand why something works as long as you know how to get it to work repeatably. And to a large extent, that was an approach that I had taken in my first company, because although I have a PhD in biochemistry, I was trained as an engineer, as undergraduate, so I approach things from an engineering standpoint. And so, especially when you employ machine learning and AI tools and techniques, a lot of that is basically correlation-based. And so what ends up happening is you can take the next value-added step if you can measure everything and ensure that you're within limits. And so the measure everything aspect is something that was embraced by the synthetic biology community very, very early on. And so they were early adopters for that reason. And that's kind of that's my own opinion, my own conclusion. But what's happened in the last 2 years, maybe 2.5, 3 years, is that we're seeing much greater widespread adoption by the more traditional biotech and pharma companies, because they're now embracing automation. And now, when you're building automation systems, the idea is that you can run it without really being there. And so remote monitoring and data from everything becomes that much more important. So as companies shift towards data-first approach, like the SynBio community, or an automation approach, like the larger companies are now starting to do, the need for our products and our data collection platform becomes that much more sort of critical.
Mm-hmm. Do you have
I don't know if that answered your question or not.
No, it's good. I'm just absorbing what you said. Do you have competition in this space, or are you kind of like the pioneering company?
So there's an element of what we do that nobody else really does. So I'd like to say in one regard we're unique, but in another regard there's a number of different companies that we do overlap with. But one thing that we're unique in is we have our own hardware. So making hardware is one of the strengths that we have. We have cloud-based computing and analytics, visualizations, and all of that. And third is we have deep expertise in machine learning and so that our analytical capabilities are quite unique. So we're able to take data from various sensors and whatnot, and then put a layer of interpretation on top of that. Probably the best example I can give you is we can look at how machines are running and understand anomalies, understand events, and understand usage patterns to say, hey, these machines are being used more or less than others. Mm-hmm. And also look at how do we characterize the usage and anomalies so that we can do predictive, we can do failure prediction. So the fact that we can do hardware and cloud and data science puts us in a very unique position. Now, there are a number of companies that will do just the IoT monitoring, so measure XYZ, and if it's out of range, send an alert. Well, that's kind of table stakes. We do that too. There's a couple of companies that do that. There's other companies that do the software and analytics piece, but they don't do the hardware. So as long as you can pipe data into their system, they'll do the visualizations and the analytics piece. But it's garbage in, garbage out. Their system is only as good as the data that gets piped into it. Mm-hmm. Our whole thesis is a core of our thesis is to our customers is really to say you're not collecting as much data as you should or could, and so a core part of our thesis is you need to collect more data, and you do that by using our platform. And so many of our customers will have existing software and analytical capabilities, and the data going into them is limited. And so we come in and say, hey, you want to put 100 or 200 more sensors around, and all that can go into your existing system. And so that's how we create value, is actually widening the pipe of data that goes in. So we're, I think, quite unique in the fact that we do all three. We do the cloud, we do the hardware, and we do the analytics.
Okay. And tell me a bit about the company. You told me the genesis story. Now, have you continued to, is it a funded company, bootstrap company? How have you built the company?
Yep. No, we're venture backed. We're a Series A company, and we've got about 35 people in the company right now.
And where are you based?
So we're primarily based in the greater Boston area, but we do have a distributed team as well. So we have folks around various parts. But we're
virtual company
headquartered. Yeah. Oh no, I think we're definitely we're headquartered here in Boston, but
Boston.
We do have people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And last question, from where you sit and from your long history in the, I guess, the biochemistry space, life sciences and biochemistry space, what other IoT open problems do you see that you're not working on, but you, because of your training and your experience, you have spotted that you would like other entrepreneurs to go after?
Yeah, there's a long list of things that of challenges and problems I wish somebody would solve, so I could just buy their solution. And so some of this is pretty obvious to anyone who's been in our industry. But when it comes to IoT, the number one challenge is power, power consumption. Everything, you can't. For example, if you want to install 500 sensors, you really can't plug them into the wall because you can't find 500 plugs somewhere. So it has to be battery powered or energy harvesting. So everything around power, energy harvesting, energy efficiency, energy storage. There's an entire area around that that I think is ripe for opportunity. If somebody come up with new materials, or if somebody can come up with a new way of doing energy harvesting, there's definitely an opportunity there on the IoT side. On the life sciences and bio side, it's even though it's not what we do here at Elemental, if I look back at my career, we really don't have great ways of measuring, from a sensor standpoint, what's happening inside the body. My first company was a glucose monitoring company. It was based on pricking your finger, getting a drop of blood, sticking it on a sensor, and getting a reading. There are companies now that have developed and are selling implantable glucose sensors. In fact, my first company, Agamatrix, is also doing that. That's something they released a couple of years ago. But there's a number of companies starting to do that. And here's the challenge. Monitoring glucose is just one molecule. That's in relatively high concentration. Even getting that one molecule in your body measured at an accurate enough level is still a challenge. But the opportunity here is, imagine having an implantable sensor that measures multiple metabolites, multiple things in your body. There's definitely an opportunity for there, but that's going to require new materials, new molecules, new sensing modalities. But implantable and continuous monitoring of biometrics, of different biomolecules, there's a huge opportunity there, especially for chronic diseases and chronic conditions. So those are two ends of the spectrum. And if I look at something in between, there's and this is something that's been highlighted the last year and a half. There's how do you sense and detect people's health and people's movement? So at least with COVID, the whole idea of contact tracing was brought into the media, and a lot of contact tracing was done manually. I mean, there's people, when I got my COVID, it's all done manually. So I think we have to realize that we are in a world we're living in a society and a time where, quite literally one person can have global impact, as was evidenced with COVID. If you look at what people have been doing in supply chain and logistics, being able to track packages around the world, we have technology for that. So imagine if we are able to do that with human beings and yet protect people from privacy, protect people's privacy and security. So I don't think anyone has actually solved that. How do you track people in a way that can completely reassure and give reassurance to people that they're not being individually tracked and monitored by the government? There's ethical issues there, but yet there's public health and public safety needs that are in conflict. So there's a great example of where there's a technological solution, but they're not able to translate that into an ethical solution. So that's less of a technology challenge, but much more of a practical sociological challenge.
Yeah, and political.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
There is an incredibly hairy political system that many countries are struggling with to get what could be a manageable public health problem sorted, just because the political systems are so cumbersome and so convoluted, and the messaging is so non-benevolent, so self-interest driven, and so on.
Well, I think you bring up a very, very good point here, in that very often many of us who come out of the technology side of things, we often forget that just having a pure technology solution isn't going to cut it.
Right.
Very often there are non-technology or non-technical barriers that need to be solved, and that is something that a lot of engineers and a lot of technical startup founders, they don't realize that just because you have a better solution doesn't mean you're going to succeed, because there are things like politics, there's things like ethics that you need to engineer around or engineer appropriately.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Well, Sridhar, terrific discussion. I enjoyed listening to you, and I enjoyed the, the discovery of the lab operations process. I fully remembered the evolution of sysadmins to DevOps and the whole trajectory there. So I think what you're providing here is a very interesting insight of the evolution on the life sciences side of that. Let me cut the recording, and I will chat with you for a moment.
Mm-hmm.